Vampires. These creatures have haunted our imaginations for centuries, stalking the night, feeding on the blood of the living. Some may even believe that there's an element of sex appeal, seduced by the ideas of eternal youth and submitting to a new, powerful entity. But where did the idea of vampires come from? Are they simply creatures of myth? Or could there be a kernel of truth to the legend? In today's deep dive, we'll explore the history, lore, and modern beliefs of vampires. From ancient superstitions to modern day sightings, we'll answer the question, are vampires real? And where does the fascination with these creatures come from? Well, sit back and relax because this should be a fun one. It's time to let the fresh air in. Hi, everyone. Welcome back, or welcome if you're new. My name is Erin, and I am fascinated by all things cult, true crime, and unique spiritual practices, and a little mysticism here and there. Throughout October, I am sharing some lore, some folklore. I'm going to be diving deep into different types of mystical entities, some spiritual practices, and even more throughout October. So, if you are curious to get some deep dives into some mystical creatures and spiritual concepts, well, then this is the place for you. Please consider subscribing. So, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So, long before the term vampire even existed, ancient civilizations had their own legends of blood sucking creatures that preyed on the living. From the Lamia of ancient Greece to the Amut of Egyptian mythology, stories of demonic entities that fed on blood were widespread across cultures. In Greek mythology, Lamia is a creature known for her monstrous but tragic origins. Initially, she was a beautiful woman, often described as a Libyan queen or princess, and sometimes depicted as a lover of the god Zeus. According to the myth, Lamia bore Zeus several children. However, when Hera, Zeus's wife, discovered this affair, she took revenge in a very cruel manner by kidnapping or killing all of Lamia's children. And in some versions, Hera even cursed Lamia, driving her mad with grief and turning her into a monster who would never find rest for eternity. The curse had a devastating effect on Lamia. Some versions of the myth suggest that Hera cursed her with insomnia, forcing her to remain awake and tormented by the loss of her children. In other accounts, Hera allows her to remove her eyes to sleep, but she must put them back in upon awakening. Lamia's grief and rage transformed her into a serpent like monster who sought revenge by stealing and devouring the children of others. So, Lamia became a figure of fear in Greek folklore, associated with the dangers that lurked for children. Seems like nobody wanted to blame Zeus, the married man, in this situation. Wow, I guess times have not changed. Over time, she evolved into that monster, sometimes described as a vampiric figure who seduced young men and drank their blood. And this portrayal aligns with a broader tradition of Greek monsters that embody both physical and psychological horror, representing the consequences of divine jealousy and wrath. Lamia's story has influenced later depictions of female monsters and seductresses, blending themes of beauty, tragedy, and danger. She's been featured in literature, including works by poets like John Keats, who further developed her mythology into a tale of love and enchantment. Her story is a compelling mix of beauty, horror, and tragedy, reflecting ancient Greek fears about infidelity, divine punishment, and the dangers posed to children. Now, in Egyptian mythology, Amut, also known as Amit, or the devourer of death, was a fearsome goddess and creature associated with the afterlife and divine judgment. Her name translates to devourer of death, and she played a critical role in the judgment of souls in the ancient Egyptian concept of the afterlife. Amut was depicted as part of the weighing of the heart ceremony, a key event in the journey to the afterlife. After a person died, their heart was weighed against the father of Ma'at, the goddess of truth, justice, and cosmic order. If the heart was lighter than a feather, then the deceased was deemed pure and could proceed to the afterlife, joining the god Osiris. However, if the heart was heavy, aka heavy with sin, Amut would devour it, condemning the person's soul to eternal restlessness. I'm like, dang, my heart is definitely going to be bigger than a feather. Amut was not worshipped in the traditional sense like other deities. Instead, she represented the fear of eternal damnation and the consequences of living an impure or immoral life. Her presence served as a reminder of the importance of living according to Mahat's principles of truth, order, and righteousness. So, you know what that means. You got to follow all the rules. And I'm really finding it fascinating that these bringers of death and judgment, but also powerful goddesses, are all women. And they're the earliest ties we have to the vampire idea. I just think that's really interesting. I can't decide if I like it, like, yes, female empowerment, or I'm like, is this another ancient way to demonize women and make us look like we're constantly judging people and each other and are basically like the bringers of doom and sin? I'm like on the cusp of it because on one hand, I'm like, these women sound really badass. And on the other hand, I'm like, well, they're also a little scary. So I'm really curious what y'all think in the comments below. Amut was a hybrid creature, combining features of some of the most feared animals in ancient Egypt. She was often depicted with the head of a crocodile, this symbolized destruction and chaos, the torso of a lion, this represented strength and power, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus, associated with aggression and danger. These animals were some of the most feared in Egypt, and by combining them, Amut embodied the ultimate force of punishment. Her appearance symbolized the devouring force that would prevent an unworthy soul from ever achieving eternal peace. And you know what? There are some people that I would like to show up for in my life as this animal figure. Not to do anything wrong, just warn them, let them know I didn't forget. According to the folklore, Amut also worked closely with the god Anubis, who oversaw the weighing of the hearts, and Thoth, who recorded the outcome of the judgment. While Anubis was responsible for conducting the ritual and Thoth determined the outcome, Amut was the executioner, waiting patiently to devour the hearts of those found guilty. Amut's role was crucial in maintaining cosmic balance, reinforcing the need for individuals to live virtuous lives aligned with Ma'at's principles. If a person failed this test, Amut would ensure that they would not find peace in the afterlife, adding an element of fear into the Egyptian moral system. Amut's presence in Egyptian mythology symbolizes the fear of divine retribution and eternal punishment. Unlike gods and goddesses who were revered and worshipped, Amut represented the darker side of the afterlife, reminding people of the importance of living according to all those rules. Her figure is a fascinating combination of myth, morality, and fear, reflecting the intricate beliefs surrounding death and the afterlife in ancient Egyptian religion. But the idea of the vampire didn't stay contained within folklore and mythology. The vampire panic that swept through parts of Europe between the 17th and 18th centuries was fueled by a mix of superstition, religion, and a misunderstanding of death and disease. During this period, widespread fear of the dead returning from the grave to feed on the living sparked mass hysteria, leading to exhumations, strange burial rituals, and even legal proceedings aimed at stopping supposed vampires. And I just feel like if someone is undead, you're not going to control them by some arbitrary human law. But maybe that's just my opinion. In Romanian folklore, strigoi are undead creatures often considered precursors to the modern vampire myth. The term strigoi comes from the Latin word strix, which means screech owl or evil spirit, and refers to the entities that rise from their graves to drain the life force from the living, primarily through blood. These creatures exist in two forms: living strigoi, who are humans with supernatural abilities, and dead strigoi, who are reanimated corpses that terrorize the living. So let's talk about the living strigoi for a second, because they sound kind of badass. So they possess these magical abilities like shapeshifting into animals, invisibility, or even the ability to leave their bodies and torment other people at night. In this Romanian belief, living strigoi are often associated with witches or people born with specific curses, and they're thought to always have malevolent intent. These strigoi are believed to possess evil spirits or be marked by some unnatural sign from birth, such as being born with a tail or an extra nipple. Some legends even suggest that living strigoi can transform into the dead variety upon their own death. So, living strigoi turns into dead strigoi, which makes a lot of sense. Now, dead strigoi are more akin to the vampire archetype. These are people who have died and then risen from their graves to feed on the blood of the living. According to the legend, people who die unbaptized, those who die violently, or those who are particularly sinful are at risk of becoming strigoi after death. So instead of going to hell, you might become a dead strigoi. These reanimated corpses come back to haunt and harm their relatives and community members, spreading disease, illness, or even death. Romanian folklore describes strigoi as nocturnal creatures, typically emerging from their graves at night to suck the blood of humans and animals. They often attack family members first, bringing misfortune or sickness to the household. The fear of strigoi was so strong that villagers took extreme measures to ensure the dead would not rise again. This often involved exhuming corpses to check for signs of strigoi, like if the body seemed unusually well preserved or had fresh blood in their mouth. Then they would take precautions, such as drive a stake through the heart of the corpse, cutting the head off of the corpse, or even burning the body. Now, there were some other rituals that Romanians believed would help protect them against strigoi. Some of these included placing iron objects like nails in the coffin or burying the body face down so that it would dig deeper into the ground if it tried to raise instead of just digging itself out of the grave. Or they would place garlic around the house. Can you imagine having just like a family member who died because maybe they committed some kind of crime, and forever you are just so paranoid that they're going to come back to haunt you that you just hang up garlic all around your house because you're just fearful that this terrible human is now a dead strigoi going to come after you? I mean, that would instill fear in anyone. So, these protective measures, especially the use of garlic and stakes, are believed to have influenced modern vampire lore. So, there are several historical accounts from Romania that report cases of suspected strigoi. For example, perhaps you've heard the legend of Petritoma. It's a well known vampire case from the 20th century in Romania, often linked to local vampire and strigoi or undead folklore. In this case, Petritoma was a man who died in the early 20th century in a rural Romanian village. Shortly after his burial, villagers began to report strange occurrences, particularly people suddenly falling ill and dying under mysterious circumstances. Many of the villagers believed that Toma had returned from the grave as a strigoi, an undead vampire, and was attacking his relatives and other villagers at night. According to the legend, some of his family members reported that they saw his ghostly figure visiting them at night, and that's what led them to severe illness. It's believed that strigoi are restless spirits or undead beings that can rise from their grave and drain blood from their family members, cause death or even disease. So, fearing this, the villagers decided they were going to exhume Toma's body. When they opened his grave, they were shocked to find that Toma's body appeared unusually well preserved, despite the amount of time that had passed since his burial. Moreover, there were reports that his body had fresh blood around its mouth, which was considered a sure sign of vampirism in the local folklore. So, in an effort to stop the attacks, the villagers followed traditional vampire slaying rituals. They staked his body through the heart to prevent him from rising again. And in some versions of the story, they also removed his heart and burned it. That just, oh, so gruesome. I mean, if you did that to my dead body and I was somehow undead, I'd be like, now you're getting double haunted. Now, after performing these rituals, the attacks reportedly ceased, which led the villagers to believe that they had successfully stopped the Strigoi. The case of Petratoma is part of a broader tradition of vampire hysteria in Eastern Europe, where beliefs in undead creatures have been widespread for centuries. Similar to other vampire legends, the Petratoma case emphasizes themes of life after death, fear of the unknown, and the power of folklore in rural communities. The Strigoi have had a significant cultural impact on modern vampire mythology, especially in influencing Bram Stoker's creation of Count Dracula, which was inspired by Romanian folklore, and the historical figure Vlad the Impaler. Today, the myth of the Strigoi continues to capture the imagination. It blends folklore, superstition, and sheer horror. In Romania, tales of the Strigoi are still part of the cultural fabric, with variations of the myth appearing in modern media and even literature. While belief in Strigoi has waned with time and modernization, certain areas of Romania still hold remnants of these legends, where fear of the undead and the use of protective charms like garlic or crosses are not entirely forgotten. Now we have Slavic folklore, or Nosferatu, referring to the type of vampire or undead being, often considered a precursor to the modern vampire archetype. The word Nosferatu is derived from the Old Slavonic term Nesuferatu, which roughly translates to plague carrier or unclean spirit. The term gained widespread recognition after being popularized by the 1922 silent film Nosferatu, directed by F.W. Murnau. Although this film was inspired by Bram Stoker's Dracula, the word Nosferatu took on a life of its own, embedding itself into vampire lore, especially in Eastern European cultures. Nosferatu were again believed to be undead creatures who would rise from their graves to suck on the blood of the living, spread death and disease, much like the popular vampire idea today. In Slavic traditions, people believed that certain conditions after death, such as improper burial rituals, violent deaths, or a sinful life, could cause a corpse to rise as Nosferatu. They would return to their village at night, terrorizing and attacking the living, especially their own family members. I mean, honestly, we might need some more of this folklore in modern day because I feel like family dynamics are so dysfunctional these days, but maybe it's just me. The Nosferatu is often described as being grotesque with a decayed corpse like appearance. So, a lot different than the beautiful, youthful, glowing, but pale idea of vampires that we see today. The Nosferatu features include pale, bloodless skin, long, sharp teeth, and elongated fingers. Traits that seem to be a little more monstrous compared to the more romanticized vampire imagery in later Western stories. In Slavic lore, Nosferatu are not seductive, but are instead horrifying and relentless in their bloodlust. They were believed to be able to spread disease, particularly the plague, which reinforced their association with death and contagion. So, there were a number of ways that you could protect yourself from a Nosferatu to prevent the dead from rising, one of which was staking the body. This was one of the most common rituals. You would drive a wooden stake through the corpse's heart to prevent it from leaving the grave. And of course, also garlic. It was used to ward off Nosferatu and other vampire like creatures. Then there was placing objects in the grave. Similarly to the Strigoi, like crosses, iron stakes, or stones would prevent the Nosferatu from ever escaping the grave. But there was also decapitation. So if a Nosferatu was suspected of causing harm to the living, the body would be exhumed, decapitated, and sometimes even burned to ensure that it would not rise again. So, the concept of Nosferatu became widely known and popular thanks to that 1922 film. The movie featured Count Orlok, a vampire character that was heavily inspired by Dracula, but portrayed in a much more grotesque and animalistic way. The film adapted the Dracula story, but Nosferatu's appearance, bald with rat like features and elongated fingers, cemented this version of the vampire into pop culture as a symbol of horror rather than seduction and lust. While Nosferatu in popular culture often refers to Count Orlok, its Slavic roots lie in much older and more terrifying beliefs about the undead and the spread of death and disease. But did you think that was it? No, no, no. We have some more Romanian folklore to uncover. Now, the Moroi are supernatural creatures that are often associated with vampires or ghosts. Now, while Strigoi are more well known, especially for their influence on modern vampire lore, the Moroi have a unique set of characteristics that make them a distinct part of vampire mythology. So, the term Moroi is often thought to derive from the Old Slavic word related to death or nightmare. In Romanian legend, Moroi are often connected to the restless spirits of the dead, particularly those who died prematurely under unnatural circumstances or without receiving proper burial rites. We're seeing a theme here. In some cases, a Moroi can also be the child of two Strigoi, thus cementing its link to vampirism. And now there are two interpretations of the Moroi in Romanian folklore. There's the living Moroi. These are children who are born with vampiric tendencies, and they're seen as living beings who have supernatural powers, such as the ability to drain the life force of others. In some legends, these living Moroi can transform into Strigoi upon death, continuing their vampiric existence beyond the grave. But of course, there's also the dead Moroi, and they're closer to the traditional vampire image. They're believed to be the spirits of dead children or infants who come back to haunt and torment the living. Just like Strigoi, they're also rising from their graves and attacking their family members first. It's so interesting that they're attacking the people closest to them first. It does imply this idea like treat your family members good, otherwise they will haunt you and bring you illness in the afterlife. So the Moroi and the Strigoi are often interconnected in Romanian lore, with both being described as undead beings. However, Moroi are sometimes distinguished by their particular focus on children or their potential origin as the offspring of Strigoi. So while Strigoi are typically viewed as fully formed adult vampires, Moroi often have a more spectral or ghost quality. And in some regions, those two terms are actually used interchangeably. So Moroi are gaunt, pale, ghostly figures that roam the night. They're sometimes portrayed as these restless spirits that have not been given proper burials or were cursed with the insatiable thirst for life energy, aka blood. And their appearance can vary depending on the region and specific tale, but they're generally feared as malevolent forces. And there are also rituals designed to protect you from a Moroi. And it's all the same thing: iron nails, stakes in the coffin, putting holy objects in the graves. And the legend of Moroi has influenced vampire stories in literature and cinema. While Strigoi is more commonly recognized, the Moroi has also been featured in works of fiction, especially in the context of Eastern European mythology. In modern culture, the Moroi have appeared in various novels, such as the Vampire Academy series by Rochelle Mead, where they are depicted as a race of good vampires who are able to live harmoniously with humans. But in folklore, Moroi represent a darker aspect of undead mythology, closely tied to the fears of death, improper burials, and supernatural retribution. So you might be wondering, why the hysteria? Why the belief in this supernatural entity? Why think that there is something undead coming back to basically curse your entire family? Well, during this period, many aspects of death and decomposition were very, very poorly understood. When bodies were exhumed, natural processes like bloating, skin receding from the nails, or blood pooling around the mouth could make corpses appear as though they had just fed on the living. So this led villagers to believe, oh, well, the deceased, they must have just become vampires. That explains it, right? And so when diseases like the plague and tuberculosis started sweeping across Europe, this contributed to the vampire hysteria. Tuberculosis, in particular, was linked to vampire beliefs because of its slow, wasting nature, where afflicted family members would appear to drain the life from one another. And the lack of scientific knowledge made these afflictions seem supernatural, and people started leaning to vampire legends to explain away the spread of sickness. Now, one of the most infamous cases of this occurred in 1732, and this is the case of Arnold Powell. It's one of the earliest and most well documented examples of a quote vampire panic in Europe. So, Arnold was a Serbian soldier who had settled in the village of Medveja, and he was reportedly troubled by supernatural fears even before his death. He had confided in villagers that during his military service in Greece, he encountered a vampire, and to protect himself, he had consumed earth from the vampire's grave and smeared himself with its blood. Despite these precautions, he believed that he still remained cursed. And Arnold died unsuspectedly in 1727, possibly from a fall. But following his death, strange occurrences began to plague the village. Shortly after his burial, several villagers reported being attacked by a spectral figure that they identified as Arnold. Those who were attacked soon fell ill and died, which fueled this growing belief that Arnold had returned from the dead as a Strigoi. The villagers, terrified by the increasing number of deaths, exhumed his body about 40 days after his death. Upon examination, they found his body in a well preserved state. His skin and nails were fresh, his lips were stained with blood. So, in the superstitious context of the time, these signs were interpreted as evidence of vampirism. So, to stop him from further attacks, the villagers performed a traditional vampire slaying ritual. They drove a stake through his heart, causing him to allegedly groan, and then they burned his body. It's like hard to wrap your brain around this, but then I feel like I could think of a few people that I know personally that might believe this if they were in that time. I mean, it's just so hard to believe, but there was a lack of any scientific understanding of what the decomposition of a body really looked like. And even after his exhumation and destruction, the vampire panic did not end. Several years later, in 1731, more villagers started dying under mysterious circumstances. And this led to the exhumation of several other bodies, many of whom were also found to be unusually well preserved, with similar signs of being vampires. So, this extended public panic and resulted in them exhuming all of those bodies and staking all of them in the village. So, this case with Arnold, it had gained widespread attention, like beyond just Serbia. The Austrian military authorities who controlled the region at the time, even they became involved. A medical officer named Johann Flukinger was sent to investigate the situation. He documented in his findings in an official report titled Visum et Repertum, Seen and Discovered, which described the exhumation of 13 bodies and the subsequent vampire rituals performed on them. This report, published in 1732, helped spread the vampire hysteria throughout Europe, and it became one of the primary sources for vampire legends in the 18th century. I mean, this case of Arnold Powell is one of the most infamous instances of vampire folklore turning into mass hysteria. That detailed report by Flukinger and the involvement of the Austrian authorities lent an air of legitimacy to the vampire phenomenon, helping cement the concept of the vampire in European folklore and culture. It also influenced later literary depictions of vampires, including the works of authors like Bram Stoker. Now, modern scholars generally attribute the Arnold Powell case to a combination of misinterpretation of natural decomposition processes with widespread superstition. In the 18th century, people were often unfamiliar with the stages of decomposition, especially when bodies were buried in cold, airtight graves. It was not uncommon for these bodies to still have their nails, to look like there was blood right around their mouths. But instead of starting to understand what decomposition looked like, villagers were terrified. I mean, also, news of vampires had started spreading across Europe, and writers, philosophers, and intellectuals became fascinated with the phenomenon. Pamphlets started being distributed, and debates arose in academic circles about whether vampires were real or simply a product of superstition. Even Voltaire got involved, but he mocked the vampire hysteria while other people took it a lot more seriously. But in the meantime, vampire legends continued to grow, particularly in Eastern Europe. And it wasn't long before these tales found their way into literature. But Voltaire, he kept mocking them. And as a part of his broader critique of superstition and irrational thinking, in his philosophical dictionary written in 1764, Voltaire wrote a satirical entry titled Vampires, where he used wit and skepticism to ridicule the vampire hysteria that had spread across Europe in the 18th century. In this entry, Voltaire sarcastically commented on the absurdity of such widespread belief in vampires, pointing out how vampire cases were mostly happening in enlightened Christian countries, yet no such phenomena were found in ancient Greece and Rome. He found it particularly ironic that people in the age of reason would believe in vampires, framing the belief as a sign of ignorance and religious fanaticism. Voltaire suggested that the spread of vampire stories had more to do with sensationalism of the time rather than any real supernatural events. He wrote, quote, "These vampires were corpses who went out of their graves at night to suck the blood of the living, either at their throats or stomachs, after which they returned to their cemeteries. The persons so sucked waned, grew pale, and fell into consumption, while the sucking corpses grew fat, got rosy, and enjoyed an excellent appetite." Unquote. By ridiculing the vampire reports in Eastern Europe, Voltaire used this as an opportunity to mock superstition more generally, linking it to religious intolerance and irrationality. His commentary reflected the Enlightenment belief in reason and evidence over superstition and unfounded fear. Voltaire's critique of vampires was part of his broader skepticism towards supernatural claims, which he saw as symptomatic of a society governed by religious dogma and uncritical thinking. You know what? I gotta say, I like my dude Voltaire. In his view, belief in vampires represented the dangers of allowing superstition to influence society and law. He aligned this with his criticism of religious and governmental institutions that perpetuated ignorance. So, by dismissing the vampire craze, Voltaire was reinforcing his advocacy for rationalism, scientific inquiry, and skepticism of all things mystical or supernatural, which were cornerstones of the Enlightenment movement. But not even Voltaire could stop the intrigue of vampires, and these creatures found themselves in literature for centuries. Now, the 19th century marked a turning point for vampires, transforming them from creatures of folklore and into icons of Gothic horror. The first significant literary vampire appeared in John Polidori's 1819 novella, The Vampire, with a Y. Polidori's vampire was a departure from the rotting corpses of folklore. Instead, he was refined, seductive, and aristocratic, a trope that would later be perfected in Bram Stoker's 1879 novel Dracula. Stoker's Dracula brought the vampire to the forefront of popular culture, drawing on Eastern European legends, particularly those surrounding Vlad the Impaler, a 15th century Romanian ruler often linked to the Dracula myth. Stoker created the definitive vampire of modern literature. Dracula was both terrifying but alluring, a creature who seduced his victims and represented a broader fear of foreign invasion and moral corruption. With the rise of film in the 20th century, Dracula became a global icon, inspiring countless adaptations and cementing the vampire's place in popular culture. While vampires have become largely fictionalized, there are still people who believe in their existence today. From modern vampire subcultures to reports of vampire like behaviors throughout history. Self identified vampires, or people who claim that they need blood to maintain their health, exist in subcultures around the world. And for some, it's a lifestyle choice, while others believe that they were born with a physical or psychological need for blood. I mean, we've even seen this with serial killers. I made a video last year about Richard Chase. It is so disgusting and disturbing, but you can check it out right here. And he thought that his impotence was caused by a lack of blood. And this drove him to murder and consume his victims' bodies. And that also includes animals. He did something particularly disgusting where he would make, ugh, I can't believe I'm about to say this. He would make a smoothie with body parts, blood, and Coca Cola and drink it. And there was evidence of it in his apartment when police finally found and arrested him. But if you want more details, you can click on this link right here. Medical conditions have also contributed to the belief in vampires. Conditions like porphyria, which can cause disfigurement and sensitivity to sunlight, or catalepsy, which is a condition that makes people appear to be dead, have been linked to vampire lore. These conditions could explain why some people were mistaken for vampires centuries ago. So, it begs the question, are vampires real? From a scientific perspective, there's no evidence that supernatural vampires exist. Many vampire legends can be explained by misunderstanding decomposition processes and medical conditions or just societal fear. However, belief in vampires persists in many parts of the world. In some regions, such as parts of Africa and Southeast Asia, belief in vampires or similar blood sucking creatures continued to influence local customs and rituals. For example, in Malawi, vampire rumors in recent years have led to violence and vigilantism. And while there's no physical proof that vampires are real, belief in these creatures remains a powerful part of human folklore. It's tied to a deeper fear about death, disease, and the unknown. But why are vampires still so fascinating? Part of their appeal lies in their complexity. They represent both fear and desire, power and vulnerability. In modern media, vampires have evolved from terrifying monsters to romanticized, tragic figures, like, thinking you can fix him. From Anne Rice's Lestat in Interview with the Vampire to the sparkling vampires of Twilight, vampires have become symbols of eternal youth, forbidden love, and the struggle with one's darker instincts. And these darker instincts lead me to human desire and the sexualization of vampires. The depiction of vampires in popular culture has evolved over time into having an emphasis on their sexualization, especially in the 20th and 21st centuries. What was once associated with death and disease has transformed into a symbol of seduction, desire, and forbidden lust. This evolution is influenced by a complex interplay of human psychology entertainment and media, and deeper subconscious desires. Now, the sexual attraction to vampires is a complex phenomenon rooted in a mix of psychology, cultural symbolism, and of course, media representation. So, why have vampires been sexualized, and why do some people feel attracted to them? Well, one is the allure of forbidden desires. And vampires often embody these forbidden desires, blending fear and seduction together. Their very existence as creatures of the night defies societal norms and death itself, and it makes them both dangerous and appealing. The act of a vampire biting its victim is often portrayed as an intimate, almost sensual experience. And this taps into deep rooted fantasies of a forbidden or dangerous love or desire. In literature and media, vampires frequently break taboos, such as crossing moral, physical, and even life death boundaries. This can resonate with people who are drawn to transgressive experiences, where what is forbidden becomes inherently more tempting or normalized. If you're a woman and you've seen Saltburn, you'll know the scene I'm talking about, but that scene, and not shaming a woman for having a period, but actually kind of enjoying that experience sexually as a man, it was very sexy to many women. It's the idea that a man or a person can still be hungry for you, even if you're in the middle of your cycle. Also, vampires are typically portrayed as powerful, immortal beings with control over their prey. This dynamic of power, with the vampire being the dominant figure and the human being the submissive one, can be appealing to those interested in power play or dominance and submission dynamics in a sexual context. Psychologically, the idea of being controlled or overpowered by a seductive and mysterious figure can evoke a strong emotional and erotic response. The vampire often takes on the role of the quote alpha figure, possessing control and confidence, which can be sexually attractive to some individuals. And then we get to the immortality and beauty aspect. Vampires are often depicted as eternally youthful and beautiful, regardless of their age. This association with immortality and beauty taps into society's obsession with youth, vitality, and physical perfection. People are naturally drawn to those qualities, and vampires offer the fantasy of possessing or being close to these traits indefinitely. Now, in books like Anne Rice's The Vampire Chronicles, the vampire is presented as timelessly elegant and seductive, reinforcing the idea that their beauty and immortality are part of their sexual allure. Vampires straddle the line between danger and seduction, which can amplify the thrill of attraction. Psychologically, people can be drawn to danger or mystery, and vampires often represent a safe fantasy of risk. The thrill of being in danger, yet being lured into it willingly, can be appealing. The bad boy or girl trope often applies to vampires. They're dangerous, but irresistible, creating a potent mix of fear and excitement. And this is also emphasized in Bram Stoker's Dracula and later adaptations, where Dracula's mesmerizing effect on his victims blurs the lines between horror and eroticism. Now, what about the act of biting? The act of a vampire's bite is often portrayed as intimate, physical, and even sexual. It involves close physical proximity and symbolically the exchange of life forces. The neck is a vulnerable and sensitive area, and that makes the bite seem more intimate. And there's also an aspect, I think, of being marked by some. Now, this physicality can resonate with fantasies of submission, pleasure, or just bodily closeness. And in many representations, the bite is drawn out as a slow, seductive act, mirroring the dynamics of sexual encounters. And now, pop culture has strongly influenced the sexualization of vampires, especially in modern media. Shows like True Blood, The Vampire Diaries, and Twilight have portrayed vampires not only as predators, but as these romantic, sexy, and desirable beings. These portrayals humanize vampires, making them, complex, brooding, and emotionally available while maintaining their supernatural allure. This shift, particularly through media, it targets younger audiences and makes vampires appeal as misunderstood, passionate figures, often fighting their darker urges in the name of love or connection. And then, of course, there's the concept of eternal love, often tied to vampires, and this taps into the fantasy of timeless devotion. In those vampire romances, the idea is that a vampire can love someone eternally, and that resonates with the deep seated human desire for lasting love and passion. The thought of being willing to stay with you literally forever because you will never die, despite those dark and dangerous natures, adds a layer of emotional intensity to that sexual appeal. And from a psychological perspective, vampires can be seen as reflections of deep seated human fears and desires, especially surrounding life, death, and sexuality. Several factors contribute to this. The idea of immortality is one of the most seductive aspects of the vampire myth. Vampires are often portrayed as these eternal beings who have transcended the limitations of mortality, retaining their youth and vitality while the rest of humanity just ages and dies. This immortality, however, comes at the price of a cursed existence, constantly needing to feed on the life force or blood of others. Now, this duality plays on the human desire to live forever while simultaneously invoking the fear of what such an existence might entail. And if we go back to the act of that vampire bite, blood is a symbol of life force, and the exchange of bodily fluids parallels the act of sex. I mean, the neck is so highly sensitive, so intimate, and it makes the act of feeding a metaphor for penetration or other intimate physical acts. Now, in Freudian psychology, the vampire bite can be seen as a form of symbolic penetration, blending themes of violence and sexuality. Freud often linked blood with sexual desire, and the consumption of blood by vampires plays into this idea of erotic power dynamics. This has given a rise to the connection between vampires and themes of domination and submission, both of which are central to many human sexual fantasies. But lusting a vampire often represents a forbidden desire. And finally, people want an escape from human vulnerability. To become a vampire is to escape the reality that human existence will end. Maybe if someone has a fear of death, physical weakness, or emotional fragility, they're more open to the idea or fantasy of vampires. Vampires often live outside the moral boundaries of human society, and this freedom from ethical constraints can be appealing to those who feel restricted by societal norms. They can engage in acts of violence or lust without consequence, allowing them to act on these base desires without fear of judgment. So, why are vampires so alluring? In the end, the sexualization of vampires is the result of a potent mix of human psychology, cultural evolution, and media portrayal. Vampires tap into our deepest desires: immortality, beauty, power, and freedom from societal norms, while also playing on our primal fears of death, the unknown, and the loss of control. Their enduring appeal lies in this delicate balance between attraction and fear. Whether through literature, film, or personal fantasy, vampires will likely continue to captivate our imaginations for generations to come, serving as a powerful symbol of the desires we harbor and the taboos we dare to explore. So, what do you think about vampires? Do they play into your fantasy? Do you appreciate the folklore? What do you believe when it comes to this entity, this being? I, for one, have not typically been attracted to vampires or the idea of vampires. But I'm curious, what do you think? And what did you think about this video? I did not know that vampire folklore went back so far. And I find it very intriguing that it started with female identifying figures or characters. So, what do you think about all that? So, guys, Please let me know your thoughts down in those comments below. I hope you liked this video. I know it's a little bit different than what we normally do here, but I thought it would be really fun this October to get a little spooky. So I hope you appreciated this video. And I will be seeing you in my next video very, very soon. But until then, stay safe, ask questions, and always stay skeptical. You have a great rest of your week, and I will see you soon. Bye.